The room isn't loud. It just smells loud. Alcohol soaked into old wood. Cigarette smoke clinging to tailored jackets. Confidence thick enough to choke on. A few stars. First tear. Men who no longer worry about being heard. Someone laughs. Not cruel. Almost friendly. Then the line drops, casual, half amused. "You're really singing for killers now? Prison songs? That's not a stage, John." The laughter comes easy, practiced, safe. Then it stops. Not because anyone is offended, because the answer doesn't fight back. It arrives slowly, calm, unemotional, so measured it feels dangerous. No insults, no defense, just a truth spoken without raising its voice. The kind of truth that doesn't ask to be accepted, and doesn't care if it is. No one laughs again. In that silence, something shifts. Not egos, not careers. Direction. Because this story doesn't begin with a scandal or a triumph. It begins with a choice. One man turns away from the shine and walks straight toward the people everyone else refuses to see. What follows isn't glory. It's cost. And the bill comes due slowly. In rooms with locked doors, in songs no one asked for, and in a quiet that stays long after the music stops. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Image, https pbs.twim.com, media. Gekwe0aacdo8.png. Image, https, all that's interesting, com, WordPress, WP content, uploads, 2018-04, Simonon, Bowie, backstage, JPG. Image, https, proudgalleries.com, CDN, shop, products, Elvis Presley, Blue Cadillac, backstage, Lou Allen Proud Galleries, London.jp.fi, 16528-9411. Image, https, D3H6K4KFL8M9P0, cloudfront.net, uploads, 2011-03 to cache, JPG. The room was meant to feel casual, but nothing about it was relaxed. Jackets were draped over chairbacks, cigarette smoke hung low, and the air carried that particular fatigue only successful men shared. The kind earned by too many nights, too many encores, too many people wanting something. Laughter came easily here, practiced and safe, the kind that never reached the eyes. Someone said it lightly, almost kindly. A half smile, a raised glass. "Those prison songs of yours, bold angle. Not exactly radio-friendly, though." It wasn't an insult. That was what made it worse. A few chuckles followed. Not cruel, just reflexive. In this room, irony was a language, and sincerity was a liability. The joke moved fast, sliding across the table like a coin, collecting approval as it went. Prison songs, as if they were a costume choice, a gimmick, something you could take off when it stopped selling. Johnny Cash didn't react. He didn't smile either. He stood near the wall, tall, still, his black jacket absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. For a moment, it looked like he hadn't heard. That pause unsettled the room more than any sharp reply could have. Across from him sat Elvis Presley, surrounded without being touched. There were people close, handlers, friends, men paid to anticipate his needs, but none of them were really with him. Elvis laughed when others did. He always did. It kept things smooth. It kept the machine running. His smile was flawless, but his eyes drifted, already moving past the moment before it finished. Cash finally spoke, quietly enough that the laughter had to die to make room for it. "They don't laugh in there." No emphasis, no edge, just a statement, delivered as if he were talking about the weather. Someone shifted in their chair. Another cleared his throat. Cash didn't look at the man who'd made the joke. He wasn't defending a record or a concept. He was somewhere else entirely. "They sit still," he went on. "Some of them don't move at all. Like if they do, something inside might break loose." The room cooled, not because anyone felt accused, but because they realized he wasn't talking to them. Elvis watched him now, not with mockery, not with challenge, with something closer to confusion. Cash wasn't playing the game. He wasn't selling mystery or rebellion. He was describing people. Men with numbers instead of names. Men whose stories didn't fit into 3 minutes and a clean chorus. "I sang for a man who wouldn't look up," Cash said. "Took him 3 songs before he trusted the sound." That was when the laughter stopped completely. No one argued. There was nothing to counter. You couldn't debate a tone like that. It wasn't a thesis. It was lived fact. The kind you either recognized or didn't. Elvis leaned back, fingers tapping his knee. An old habit. He understood instinctively what was happening, even if he couldn't follow it. Cash was stepping into a place the rest of them avoided. Not because it was dangerous to their image, but because it threatened the distance they depended on. The distance between stage and seat. Between star and consequence. The man who'd joked raised his glass again, tried to smooth it over. "Well," he said, softer now, "guess it's working for you." Cash nodded once. Not agreement. Closure. As the conversation drifted elsewhere, Elvis remained still, watching Cash from across the room. For the first time that night, he didn't feel protected. He felt exposed. Not by accusation, but by the quiet realization that there were truths he could never afford to sing about. Cash picked up his coat. No goodbyes, no triumph. Just the sense that something irreversible had happened. He hadn't crossed a line. He'd erased it. And somewhere beneath the hum of easy talk returning, one thought lingered, unspoken, but shared by more than one man in that room. If he was willing to go there, what would it cost him to keep going? Image, https, ebaymg.com. Images, G, M1IA, SWRJVOG, XB, SL1200. JPG. Image, https, ebaymg.com. Images, G, 7LWAOSWFAPJ2HAQE, SL1200. JPG. Image, https, w.library.ca.gov.up. Content, uploads, 2021-08, cache2.jpg. Image, https, www.mediastorehouse.com, P629, busy, highway night, 11928284, JP WebEP. The first prison wasn't on any schedule that mattered. No posters, no advance notice, no sense that it would become anything more than a footnote managers preferred to forget. The road leading there was narrow and uneven, cutting through flat land that smelled of dust and fuel. The car radio lost signal miles before the gates came into view. Johnny Cash didn't talk much on the drive. He rarely did then. Fame had arrived fast, louder than he expected, and it brought with it a constant noise. Opinions, plans, advice. The quiet outside the windshield felt earned. The prison rose out of it like a concrete afterthought, functional and indifferent, a place designed to outlast the men inside. At the gate, the guard looked at the paperwork twice. Then, once more, slower. "You sure about this?" he asked, not unfriendly. Just puzzled. Cash nodded. That was all. Inside, the air changed immediately. Metal carried a smell you couldn't mistake. Old sweat, disinfectant, rust. Doors didn't slam here. They closed with a final, deliberate weight, like punctuation. Every sound echoed longer than it should. The guards moved with routine efficiency, eyes forward, hands loose but ready. There was no stage, just a cleared space, a few rows of bolted benches. The men were brought in quietly. No cheering, no boos. Some stared straight ahead. Others watched the floor. A few looked at Cash with open suspicion, as if waiting for the trick. The warden leaned in and spoke low. "They won't cause trouble. Just don't expect much reaction." Cash didn't answer. He was busy noticing the way one man's hands shook, how another kept rubbing a scar on his wrist as if it still itched. These weren't villains from a headline. They were tired, stripped of any audience instinct. Applause wasn't part of their vocabulary anymore. He started playing without introduction. The songs landed differently here. Not as performances, but as sounds filling a space that was usually silent. Halfway through, a man in the front row finally looked up. Younger than Cash expected, eyes hollow, but alert. "Sing that one again," the man said when the song ended. Not a request. A test. Afterward, there was no line of hands to shake. No compliments. Just one guard lingering near the door, and that same young man, standing uncertainly, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to speak. "You ain't singing about prison," the man said finally. "You're singing about before it." That stayed with Cash longer than the drive out. The shows continued. Small places. No pay, or barely enough to cover gas. His manager argued. The label questioned the optics. "This isn't your audience," they said. "They don't buy records." But Cash wasn't chasing buyers. He was listening. Each prison sounded the same at first. Keys, boots, doors. But the men were different. Some talked too much afterward. Others said nothing at all. One older inmate leaned close once and whispered, "Don't stop coming. Makes the week shorter." In cheap hotels afterward, Cash lay awake, staring at stained ceilings, hearing those doors again in his head. He began to understand something that unsettled him. The songs weren't about bars or sentences. They were about the moment before the fall, about knowing you were wrong and not knowing how to turn back. Fame, he realized, had its own locks. The difference was only visibility. By the time he pulled into another prison yard weeks later, he no longer needed to be convinced. Whatever this was costing him, it was also holding him together. And walking away from these rooms, these men, felt more dangerous than any warning his career had come with. Image, https, ipenimage.com, 736X, 94F926D, 94F96, 46A4B, 38TD046724608 JPG, image, https size.edu, Elvis Presley music.com.au, pictures, IMG Elvis 60s 60 1960 July 26 Bobby, Darren JPG, image, https wtennessean.com, GCDN Presto 2206 03 Panazzi 8A1439, C473445 8184 F372E86794 F66121B. JPG, auto to web PNG fit crop run format, JPG and height 554 run width 700. Image, http advance, w.garboforever.com, builder, Garbo, and MGM dressing room.jpg. By the early 60s, the difference between them had stopped being subtle. Backstage corridors grew brighter, cleaner, more controlled. Everything had a system now. Clipboards, call times, people whose only job was to make sure nothing went wrong. In these places, spontaneity was treated like a hazard. Someone always hovered near the door, listening for raised voices, ready to smooth things over before they became stories. Elvis Presley moved through this world like its most valuable artifact. Everyone adjusted around him without being asked. Questions were phrased carefully. Decisions were presented as suggestions that had already been approved. He didn't need to demand control. The structure demanded it for him. What he wore, what he sang, when he spoke, each choice buffered by layers of reassurance. Johnny Cash arrived alone more often than not. No entourage, no choreography. He showed up early, stood off to the side, listened. His reputation followed him in fragments. Unreliable, difficult, brilliant, reckless. The industry hadn't decided what to do with him, which made him dangerous in a quieter way. They crossed paths in these narrow spaces, sometimes without words. A nod, a brief smile, familiarity without closeness. The joke from years earlier was never repeated. It didn't need to be. It lived on as an absence, something neither of them touched directly. One afternoon, between rehearsals, Elvis found Cash near a vending machine that hummed louder than necessary. For once, There were no handlers close enough to interrupt. Just a few minutes that hadn't been scheduled. "You still doing those shows?" Elvis asked. His voice was casual, but his eyes weren't. Cash didn't pretend not to understand. "Yeah." Elvis nodded, slow. "Takes guts." It wasn't praise, it wasn't criticism, it was something closer to confession. He leaned back against the wall, thumb tapping his ring. "They wouldn't let me," he said, almost to himself. "Not like that." Cash didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. The answer stood between them: contracts, expectations, the weight of being watched by millions who didn't want surprises. Elvis had become a place people visited, not a man who moved freely. "You don't have to explain," Cash said. That landed heavier than agreement would have. Elvis exhaled through his nose, a short laugh without humor. "Funny thing," he said. "I hear about those prisons more than you think." Cash studied him then. The immaculate hair, the flawless jacket, the fatigue buried beneath polish. For a moment, he saw the cost clearly. Not as envy, not as judgment, as fact. "I never tried to convince anyone," Cash said. "I just go." Elvis looked at him, really looked this time. There was no resentment there, just something unspoken tightening behind his eyes. He understood the truth of what Cash was doing. That was the problem. Understanding didn't make it possible. A stage manager's voice cut through the corridor. Time was up. Elvis straightened instantly, the mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Take care of yourself," he said. It sounded sincere. It also sounded final. As he walked away, Cash felt the distance settle between them. Not dramatic, not hostile. Permanent. Two paths that had crossed long enough to reveal the cost of each other's choices. Neither of them had won that exchange, but one of them could still decide where to walk next. Image, https, exhibits.library, uvic.ca, images 13236, full IRO, default JPG. Image, https, compote.slate.com, images 2TFA9409, 94CB45A3, 8C5, 01.53B4 JPG crop 65% 2725%, 2% 2COR, image, chotipuahadr.tennessean.com, GCDN Presto 2020 20602 PNAS F8984D69 2919 49F09C087356553B0C 690501 03 JPG Auto Air Web PGenda Fit Crop Urine Format PJP Guna Height 470 Brannan Wither 700 Image HTTPS boundarystones.weta org sites default files styles embed full width public 2024 03 Ella percent 20 Fitzgerald percent 20 performing percent 28% 20 Lorton percent 20% 219590 26% 20% 2006 1 Starbio 2 Fitzgerald Ella 03% 20% 20 cropped JPSD 6 DT Andani Tux KPVHS 5J. By the middle of the decade, the margins were gone. There was no buffer anymore between momentum and collapse. The calendar filled and emptied in uneven bursts. Shows canceled without explanation, radio playlists quietly changing, familiar names answering calls with shorter sentences. The industry didn't argue with Johnny Cash now. It simply adjusted around his absence, the way it always did when a risk stopped paying off. Johnny Cash felt it first in his body. His voice roughened in places it never had before. His hands shook when the lights went out, and there was nothing left to perform against. Sleep came in fragments. Silence pressed harder than noise ever had. The arrests blurred together. Not dramatic scenes, no flashing headlines at first, but small humiliations that accumulated weight. A night in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and old paper. A deputy who recognized him and looked away, embarrassed for both of them. Each incident chipped at whatever trust still existed between Cash and the people who handled his career. The label meetings changed tone. No raised voices, just numbers slid across desks. Sales, liability, risk. Words that treated a man like a malfunctioning asset. And yet, the prison dates stayed on the schedule. Sometimes they were the only ones. He drove himself more often now. Long stretches of highway where the road hummed beneath the tires like a warning you couldn't quite decipher. He showed up hollow-eyed, thinner, carrying less than he used to. Guards noticed. Some watched him with suspicion, others with something closer to concern. After one show, he didn't leave right away. The room had emptied. Benches stood crooked where men had shifted their weight. A paper cup lay crushed near the wall. Cash sat alone on a folding chair, head bowed, guitar resting against his knee. He tried to stand and realized he couldn't. Not yet. His legs refused, as if the concrete had claimed him. A guard lingered near the door, unsure whether to intervene. "You all right?" the man asked. Cash nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. That was when an inmate stepped closer. Middle-aged, weathered. He'd been quiet during the performance, eyes fixed forward, expression unreadable. "Funny thing," the man said, voice low. "People think you come here to save us." Cash looked up. "But I can tell," the inmate continued. "You're hiding same as we are, just got better shoes." The words hit clean. No accusation, no admiration, recognition. Cash didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth settled heavy in his chest. These songs, the ones everyone argued about, were keeping him upright. They gave shape to something inside him that might otherwise scatter. But they also kept him close to the edge, night after night, forcing him to sit with what he couldn't outrun. Outside, the world continued to narrow. Stations stopped calling. Promoters hesitated. Old friends offered advice he didn't ask for, framed as concern. He heard versions of the same sentence everywhere. Maybe take a break. But the prisons didn't suggest breaks. They waited, unmoved by reputation or ruin. Cash understood then that the choice he'd made years earlier was no longer theoretical. It was costing him in real time. Health, trust, future. And still, the idea of walking away felt like a deeper kind of failure. That frightened him more than the arrests ever had. As he finally stood and made his way toward the exit, he realized something with quiet clarity. These songs were no longer just about survival for the men behind bars. They were the thin line keeping him on his feet. And thin lines, once crossed often enough, don't forgive hesitation. Image, https://sfae.blob.core. Windows.net, Chart Media, e-commerce's site, Media, SFAE, Artwork, 800, Johnny. Cash outside Folsom, Prison Folsom K, 1968 Buan JPG. Image, https:// townsquare.media, site, 204, files, 2018-12, Johnny Cash, Prison Concerts, Grammy Museum, 2.jp Qualas, Sifi Sadi Funhaif, 780. Image, https:// Folsom Cash Art Trail. Portals, Zedrubaro Images, blog photos, The Real Story of Johnny Cash Folsom, Prison Blues, 1 Dawn JP Giver. U65 Co MX6 ABZO ABBWOCG %3D. Image, https c and res cloudinary.com, networks, image, upload, C, fill, bar, 2 car. 1.77% 2C 2 3840% 2CH 2160% 2CG auto DPR auto F auto percent 3 eco V1517293080 I31s Expa Vazgid 0. The morning at Folsom Prison began without ceremony, no banners, no anticipation outside the walls. Inside, everything moved with procedural caution. Guards double-checked doors. A supervisor reread the schedule, then folded it again, as if paper alone could still control the day. Johnny Cash waited in a bare room with peeling paint and a single buzzing light. He didn't warm up his voice. He sat still, elbows on his knees, staring at a scuff mark on the floor. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what would happen once he stepped forward. Not whether the show would succeed, but whether it would leave him intact. A guard leaned in. "You ready?" Cash nodded, though readiness wasn't the word. He felt stripped of defenses. No swagger, no certainty, just the weight of having arrived here by refusing to turn back. The room they brought him into didn't resemble a concert hall. Rows of men sat close, shoulders squared, faces alert but restrained. Not hostile. Watchful. These were not fans waiting to be impressed. They were witnesses deciding whether to listen. Cash walked out without introduction. The first notes cut through the space cleanly. No echo tricks. No production cushion. Every sound landed exactly where it fell. When he sang, heads lifted, not in excitement, but in recognition. This wasn't entertainment in the usual sense. It was acknowledgement. Between songs, there was no applause, just a held silence that pressed in from all sides. Cash felt it immediately. This was not a crowd responding. It was a room measuring truth. Halfway through, something shifted. A low murmur passed through the benches. Not laughter, not noise, but permission. As if the men had decided he was allowed to be there. That was the moment Cash understood. This room wasn't a stage. It was a court. When the last note faded, the silence returned. Deeper now, heavier. Then a sound rose, uneven at first. Not clapping, not cheering. A collective release, raw and untrained. Approval without polish. Backstage afterward, no one spoke for several seconds. The recording crew stared at each other. Someone finally said, "We got it." They didn't yet know what it was, only that something irreversible had been captured. The response outside the walls came fast. The same executives who once questioned the wisdom of prison shows spoke in confident tones. Historic. Authentic. Necessary. Words arrived polished, retrofitted to success. Cash heard them all without reacting. Because in another part of the country, Elvis Presley heard the news too, through handlers, through industry whispers, through a clipped mention that didn't invite discussion. Elvis said nothing. He didn't criticize. He didn't congratulate. Silence was the only response he had left. For Cash, the recognition brought no relief. Only clarity. He saw now what the victory demanded. He was no longer just a man making difficult choices. He had become a symbol, and symbols were expected to endure without breaking, to speak without wavering, to stand in places others couldn't. As he left Folsom, the gates closing behind him with that familiar final sound, Cash understood something that unsettled him more than failure ever had. Being right didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a longer sentence, one he would have to carry alone. Image, https .theterraclipper.com WP content, uploads, 2016 Tartar 7, HQ default $40 JPG, edit image, http elvispresleymusic.com, AU pictures, IMG Elvis 70s 1970 February 18 backstage with fan Las Vegas 2.jmi image https hipshearstaps.com HMG prod images bassist John Paul Jones singer Robert Plant and guitarist news photo 157916401 Bon Jaban image https on thefinestphotos.com BP content uploads 222103 L00610 JPG. By the early 70s, the noise around success had changed shape. For Johnny Cash, it no longer came from doubt. It came from expectation. The television lights were softer than prison fluorescents, but they were relentless in a different way. Every guest slot, every song choice, every pause between words carried weight. He was introduced now as a voice of conscience, a man who stood for something. The title followed him everywhere, heavier than any criticism ever had. The show ran smoothly, too smoothly. Applause cues landed on time. Cameras moved like clockwork. Cash smiled when required, nodded when spoken to, delivered songs with a steadiness that looked like control from the outside. Few noticed how carefully he measured his energy, how silence afterward took longer to release him than it once had. Between tapings, he sat alone more often, not hiding, resting. The battles were quieter now, but no less constant. He had learned how to survive them, not how to win. Across the country, the world around Elvis Presley had narrowed. The stages were bigger, brighter, sealed off from unpredictability. Dressing rooms felt less like preparation spaces and more like containment. Schedules tightened, conversations shortened. Decisions arrived fully formed, already justified. The comeback everyone talked about came with conditions: medication, isolation, control disguised as care. Their paths no longer crossed directly. Instead, information traveled through intermediaries. A mutual friend mentioned Cash's last prison visit. Someone else repeated an offhand comment Elvis had made. Nothing critical, nothing warm, just awareness. "He follows through," Elvis had said once, according to someone who'd been there. Not admiration, not regret. A statement of fact. That was enough. One message reached Cash years after that early joke had faded from memory. It wasn't a letter, just a relayed sentence, softened by distance, but intact in meaning. Elvis had heard another prison recording. He'd listened all the way through. No commentary afterward. Cash understood what wasn't being said. There was no apology to wait for. No explanation owed. Whatever tension once existed had burned down to something simpler: recognition without resolution. Two men who had seen the cost of their choices too clearly to pretend otherwise. Cash felt no urge to respond. The idea of winning, of being right, had lost its appeal. Watching the industry close in on Elvis, he saw how easily conviction could turn into confinement. Different bars, same result. One night, after a taping wrapped early, Cash stood alone on the empty set. The audience seats were dark. The silence felt earned. He didn't speak. He didn't sing. He just stood there, breathing evenly, letting the quiet do its work. He knew then that the mockery from years earlier no longer mattered. It had dissolved into something irrelevant, small. What remained was understanding. Too late to change anything. Early enough to stop pretending. When words finally failed them both, clarity took their place. And clarity, Cash had learned, was heavier than conflict. But it didn't ask to be defended. Image, https, townsquare.media, site, 204, files, 2018-12, Johnny Cash, prison concerts, Grammy Museum, 1 Don Tuan Jepgi, Q75, RNW, 780s. Image, https, upload, Wikimedia. Org, Wikipedia, Commons, Thumb, FF9, Johnny Cash, %22, The Johnny Cash, Spring, Special, %22, %281979, CBS Pressic, Photo person29.jpg 960px Johnny Cash, %22 The Johnny Cash, Spring Special %22 2811979 CBS Press, Photo person29.jpg, Image, https has cdn.images, Express, Code UK IMG Dynamic, 35590X, Elvis, Presley, Death and Funeral, The Final, 48 Hours, 16562193, WebRD, 1666, 1637 Image, https under cdnprod.website, files.com, 622FAB5E4AF9AC2 and WinNMR6, 6917237FBC99837992E4BX3581094383180842961706108 460429617061008 4642193703218 The news reached him without drama. No ringing phone in the middle of a performance. No producer whispering urgently from the wings. It came the way irreversible things often do, quietly, through a passing sentence, spoken without ceremony. Elvis Presley was gone. Johnny Cash didn't sit down. He didn't reach for anyone. He stood where he was, hands at his sides, absorbing the weight of a fact that felt heavier precisely because it arrived so plainly. Death, stripped of spectacle, had a way of clarifying things. What surfaced first wasn't music, not the records, not the performances frozen in time. It was a room, decades earlier, Low light, smoke, a half-joking remark about prison songs, and his own answer, measured, calm, final. He remembered the pause more than the words, how silence had done the work for him. He understood now how small that moment had been, and how long its shadow stretched. Cash didn't speak publicly right away. He wasn't asked to. Silence had become expected of him in moments like this, as if restraint itself were a role he'd been cast into. He accepted that. There were things words only diluted. Weeks later, he stood inside another institution. Not a famous one. No cameras. Just a narrow room with hard benches and men who carried their time visibly. The air was cool, faintly metallic. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed with the same final sound he'd known for years. He began to speak. Not about loss, not about legacy. Certainly not about Elvis. He talked instead about listening. About how easy it was to laugh at what felt distant. About how difficult it was to stay present once you realized distance was an illusion. The men watched him carefully, not searching for comfort, listening for honesty. These songs, he said, voice even, they're not for sympathy. He let that sit. They're reminders. No flourish followed. No explanation. Later, alone, Cash considered the long arc that had carried him here, the mockery that had never truly been cruel, the success that had never truly been safe, the prisons that had given him something no stage ever had, a place where pretense couldn't survive. Elvis had been protected from that kind of exposure, guarded, shaped, contained, until the walls became invisible. Cash didn't romanticize it. He saw the cost clearly now, not as tragedy, as consequence. There was no satisfaction in comparison, only responsibility. Years earlier, he'd chosen to step closer to what most people avoided. Not to make a point, but to hear something true. That choice had demanded payment again and again. It had taken pieces of him he'd never recover. It had given him clarity he could never set down. As he left the room, the men rose, not in applause, not in reverence, simply standing, as if acknowledging that what had been shared belonged to all of them now. Outside, the sky was empty and pale. Cash paused before getting into his car. For a moment, he listened, to the quiet, to the absence of music, to the space left behind by voices that no longer spoke. The prison songs had never been about walls. They had been about freedom, what it costs, who pays it, and how few are willing to look at the bill. He drove away without turning on the radio. Some silences, he knew by then, were meant to remain unfilled.